Good evening, everybody. It is Sunday, October 23rd, 4:30 in New York, 2:30 in Wyoming. It's another episode of Foundations of Development with Professor DeNobili. Um, I don't know what happened to me this week. This week kind of got lost this week. It might have been having Monday off, and then we had PSATs on Wednesday. I had to go up to Albany on Thursday, but there was a whole lot going on this week. I apologize for getting Vygotsky out this late in the week. Um, I'm gonna try to get Bandora out as soon as I can next week. Now, Bandora for some reason is out of order. I might have messed up when I switched out the theorists. I probably should have left Bandora where he is. You're gonna notice in terms of development of theories, we're kind of taking a step back next week, but we'll get there when we get there, and whatever. You've noticed it because there were Bandora questions on the quiz that I'm not going to hold against you. Speaking of the quiz is due. The exam is due tonight. I also reopened exam 1 for those of you who needed to go back and do exam 1. Both of them are due tonight. So I wanted to start off with a little do now. How do you learn how to swim? This also applies to how do you learn how to ride a bike? And this is very Vygotskyan in nature. So you have the comfort zone, which is this first area up here. You have what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development, meaning this is the Goldilocks zone. This is the sweet spot. This is where most of the learning happens. And then this is currently out of reach. This outer ring is currently out of reach for the learner where they're currently at within their zone of proximal development, but eventually this will become their zone of proximal development. And what do you notice in the zone of proximal development? You have the more knowledgeable other. In most cases, it's the teacher. Teacher can be seen as many different things, such as a parent or a professional teacher. But within that zone of proximal development, you have a more knowledgeable other who scaffolds and teaches and provides, in this case, the swimmies and the support. If it's riding a bike, the training wheels and support. In teaching concepts and ideas, we provide scaffolding, and we're going to get all into it on this episode of Foundations of Learning. As always, we're going to start with the roadmap. We're going to discuss Vygotsky. As I said before, exam 2 is due tonight. Your next written assignment is reflection 3, due on November 8th. Midterm grades went out, so you'll notice those as well in the coming days. And then a preview of the next few weeks. We're going to go to Bandora next week, which starts tomorrow. Bandora, followed by Freud, and then 2 weeks of Erikson. You'll find out why we're doing 2 weeks of Erikson. It's not because Erikson is so much greater or so much special compared to the other theorists. That's just how we ended up with the time frame. So here we go. So Vygotsky's right here in our chart, our nature versus nurture chart. And the reason why he's closer to the right, you can tell he's very much center right, it's because his is around social historical theory. What he brings to the table in terms of the learning process is the importance of the social historical context, the social cultural historic context, and the idea that the child is the product of their culture and time and place. And we're going to look into it more as we go along. So here we go. Vygotsky. I love his first name, Lev. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his middle name, but Semyonovich Vygotsky. I love the name Vygotsky. It's just and he looks quite dapper right there. He was a Soviet psychologist, even though he was born in 1896, so it wasn't until 1914, I believe, that he becomes a Soviet psychologist. But with that said, the Soviet, speaking of social historical influence, the Soviet setup of what he lived during his time really affected his theory. And what's interesting is that the Soviets banned him until the 1950s as far as his work was concerned. He's founder of an unfinished theory of human culture and biosocial development, commonly referred to as the cultural historical psychology. He was born November 17th, 1896. His birthday's coming up soon. In Orsha, Russia, which is north of Moscow. Must have been really cold. He died really young. He died 38 in Moscow from, I believe it was tuberculosis. He's influenced initially by Jean Piaget, even though he criticizes him through his theory. He criticizes Jean Piaget, obviously under Soviet Russia, by Karl Marx, Kurt Lewin, and later Alfred Adler, who was a contemporary of him. Alfred Adler is best known for his individual psychology. Alfred Adler is the second school of the second Austrian school of psychology. The first was Freud, and the third was Frankl. But Adler was a student of Freud. Maybe we'll get to him at some point in the course. I'm not sure if we'll have enough time. So we think he was influenced by these, but it's hard to know what got through. His protege, Dr. Luria, continued his work into the late 1950s, which during that time is when Vygotsky's work was actually unbanned in Russia. Vygotsky's books, as I say here, was banned in Soviet Russia and only came to the West in the late 1950s. It's unclear what they were afraid of, but as I said before, Alfred Adler was about individual psychology. Vygotsky has a lot to do with student-centered instruction and the social historical context, which includes the family. So what it seems to be as what Soviet Russia might have been afraid of in terms of Vygotsky's work is that the state isn't in charge of the education of the individual child. It's the social historical constructs, which includes the family. And, for Soviet Russia, they had to be in charge of everything, including education. So that's Vygotsky in a nutshell. Key ideas from Vygotsky's theories. Some cognitive processes are seen in many species. Others are unique to humans. These so-called lower and higher functions. A higher function would be abstraction. So, for example, a blackbird can load the vessel with rocks to raise the water level. I'm sure you've seen those videos before. Animals can use tools in order to find solutions to problems. But can they abstract that knowledge, that trick, to other circumstances, or can they explain what they did? Humans can do that, and most oftentimes animals cannot. Every culture passes on physical and cognitive tools. Adults convey cultural interpretations through informal interactions and formal schooling, known as mediation. That's one of Vygotsky's terms, mediation. We're going to go more in depth on that later on. Children acquire tools in their own idiocentric manner, which is called appropriation. So when children acquire those tools and make it their own, they appropriate the mediation, if that makes sense. All right, complex mental processes begin as social activities and evolve into mental activities, which is known as internalization. Um, Play allows children to stretch themselves cognitively. Thought and language become independent, and then self-talk becomes inner speech. We're going to go more in depth in these concepts in the next few slides. Challenging tasks promote cognitive growth. So as we saw at the beginning with the zone of proximal development, children can perform. So when you read in the textbook, what the textbook says is oftentimes tests don't really help us much in understanding the skill level of a child because, or as a better idea, it may show us the current skill level, but it doesn't show us the potential of where they can go. So, for example, a child may test at a 4th grade level, but that test was done independently. The child did it on their own. What the test does not show is what if the child had prompting and help from a more knowledgeable other? Might they have tested at a higher level if they were prompted and given scaffolds to see where it'd be? Because now they may have tested at a 4th grade level, but they may also have the ability to reach, let's say, a 6th or 7th grade level. So now we have a zone of proximal development of 4th grade to 6th or 7th grade. And now herein lies our breathing room. The child may be at a 4th grade level on their own. With scaffolding and support, they can get to a 6th or 7th grade reading level. Now it's the teacher's job. Can the teacher get them to a point in 1 year? Maybe, maybe not, depending on the pedagogical approaches and the scaffolding. Can the teacher get them to a point where, okay, maybe they're not at a 6th or 7th grade reading level, but maybe they're at a 5th or 6th grade reading level, and then there's progress in their individual independent work. So children can perform more challenging tasks when assisted by a more knowledgeable other. And they take us into and out of the zone of proximal development. It is the teacher's responsibility to challenge students into the zone of proximal development, to get them out of their comfort zone of what they're capable of doing on their own. And by challenging them, you get them to a point of progress where their zone of proximal development is now going to shift. I usually explain to my students, I will teach you a grade level above where you are, but I'm here to support you. So my new standard isn't if you're in 9th grade, I'm going to teach you as if you're 10th graders. I have moved their zone to be more challenging, and I'm going to help support them. In that process, I'm going to see who needs more or less support to get them to there. I have to say, by doing that, I have seen a lot more progress as opposed to remediation. So, for example, if they're at a 4th grade reading level and they're testing at a 4th grade reading level, I'm not gonna say that their zone is 6th or 7th grade. I'm gonna teach them at a grade level above because they may not get to that 10th grade level, but I want to make sure I can get the maximum amount of growth in one particular year. But I'm doing that within that zone of proximal development. Now, with that said, I have to monitor the students as you go along, because if it is too challenging, if they can't get there, then you might be wasting your time, and you might be because students will eventually shut down. That's discussed in the chapter as well. So again, the zone of proximal development, the current understanding, they can work unassisted. This is their comfort zone. This is the zone of proximal development, learning through scaffolding, and this is what's currently out of reach. I'm going to tell you, this is Vygotsky in a nutshell. If you know this, you know Vygotsky. All the other things are important, but ZPD is everything in terms of Vygotsky. The zone of proximal development is where we get our concept of scaffolding, which, if you're going to be teachers, this is everything. Scaffolding relates to differentiated instruction. How are you going to scaffold for individual students depending on where they're at? This is also known, as you see further down the line, the gradual release of responsibility model. It's also called that. But in essence, it's a function of who does what and when they do it. So the scaffolding process looks like this. The teacher does and models, and then the student watches. Then the teacher does it again, but this time the student helps. And then there's a switch. Now the teacher helps while the student does. And then lastly, the teacher watches while the student does. Now this is the full formal one. I'm doing something similar this week with my students. We're analyzing poetry. So I'm not doing the second step. These are high school students. So being that they're high school students, I don't have to always scaffold in step-by-step process. But I'm going to analyze 2 poems for them Monday. And I'm going to give them a presentation of how I'm going to analyze poetry. And I'm going to say, you're going to do the same thing on your own. You're going to give presentations throughout this week on your own poems that they get to choose from. But I'm going to model for them while they watch. And they're going to take notes while they watch. Then, if they need help, I will give them their assistance in planning. But essentially, they're going to analyze the poems then on their own of what they're going to do. And then they're going to give presentations to the class, and I'm going to watch them. And by doing that, I will see, did they get it? Did they understand the process of analyzing poetry? I've also further scaffolded by giving them a graphic organizer for them to follow step by step of the process. And my presentation is going to go through that graphic organizer to show them this is how you use the graphic organizer. So that is scaffolding in practice. It's also known as reciprocal teaching. And this is very key and this is what I really like about Vygotsky. It's this idea that the teacher is not the arbiter of truth. The teacher is not, oh, you must bow down to me because I am the teacher and I am the purveyor of all knowledge. No, there's reciprocal teaching going on. When the students are going to be giving their presentations on the poems, I already have my own ideas and interpretations of the poems, but they're probably going to give more insights that I'm probably not going to know in that moment when I was reading and analyzing the poetry. And therefore, the teacher becomes a student and the student becomes a teacher. That is reciprocal teaching. I've learned more from my students than I've probably taught them over the years. Believe it or not. And many people think that's weird. They're like, oh, you're supposed to be teaching them more. Those who teach will understand what I'm talking about, and hopefully you'll understand what I mean as you become teachers yourselves. Mediation, in their interactions with children, adults share the meanings they attach to objects, events, and the human experience. How do I know a tree is a tree? Because my kindergarten teacher taught me that a tree is a tree. The symbol of the word tree was connected to the picture of the word tree. And then I was able to create a mental image of a tree. But it's within the cultural context that adults, whether it was my parents or my teachers when I was a child, that they were able to hand it off to me. This transforms the situation for the child, because I'm not going to look at a dog and say, "Oh my God, that's a tree." I now know what a tree is within my cultural context. This helps make the child make sense of experience in culturally relevant or appropriate ways, and this is known as mediation. Um, Essentially, think of mediation as this: mediation is um, culturally relevant understandings that are passed down from generation to generation. So, for example, um, oftentimes we may see within families where they'll get a rump roast from the butcher, and they'll cut the ends. And even though it makes no sense, because um, the rump roast may fit in the current pan that you get from the store. But if you go back generation to generation to generation, you get to the great grandparents, and they'll say, "Well, it's very easy to understand why we cut the rump roasts. We cut the ends because they don't fit in the pan. So the pans from, let's say, 80, 90 years ago maybe didn't fit the rump roasts. But as generations went down and generations passed, you cut the ends of the rump roast to fit the pan. And so now, even if the pans are big enough, the current generation is still cutting the ends because that's what you do. Now, I don't know if that makes sense, but the point is this: mediation is the passing down of that knowledge from generation to generation. And then the children of each generation take that knowledge and make it their own. Um, uh, this brings us to inner speech. So we think using the words that our language provides. When we speak, therefore, we speak our minds, so to speak. Thought and language are two different things for the developing child. Early thinking occurs independent of language via symbols. When language does appear, it is first used primarily as a means of communication and not as a means of thought. So when we first start learning to talk, it's usually to say, "I'm hungry. I did doo doo in my diaper." I don't just we're trying to communicate something to somebody else, usually at first our parents, and then to the other people around us. At about age 2, they start to become intertwined. Self talk happens at this point, and we can see children talking. They start babbling to themselves, they start talking to themselves. Um, and eventually, this talk becomes inner speech, where they talk to themselves silently. Now, I have to say, as an adult, there are often times when I'm trying to think through something. I may speak to myself out loud in order to, we're going to talk about metacognition in a second, but to think through a process. And even though I'm thinking out loud, it's my inner speech, because I would probably feel uncomfortable speaking out loud to myself when other people are in the room, because people are going to think that I'm having a conversation with myself. And in a way, I kind of am, but not in the mental health sort of way, so to speak. Sometimes if I need to think through something, I may need to hear it. May need to hear the words. Sometimes what people do is I may go to a trusted person, and I may share my ideas with them, but I'll tell them, "Look, I'm not looking for advice. I just want to bounce ideas off of you and see if they make sense." Essentially, we do inner speech most of the time, but just like little children who speak to then um modify their behavior, we as adults do that sometimes as well, whether it's with ourselves or with a trusted other, in order to metacognate. Leads us to metacognition. The growing awareness of our own thoughts. Literally, metacognition. Meta means beyond. It's thinking about thinking. Meta writing is writing about writing. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. The acquisition of cognitive tools, tools that relate to symbols that are culturally relevant. Abstract reasoning. Cultural sign systems are critical here. Human powers of thought are impossible without them. Abstract reasoning based largely on those sign systems, the ability to use symbols to cognate, to think. They're usually found in technologically advanced societies. Vygotsky student Luria studied this with remote tribes in Russia. This is all chronicled in the textbook. It's done really well. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. Zone of proximal development. We cannot teach just any concept to any child. We can assess for their readiness, but that measure is only for independent learning. I discussed this earlier. Collaboration precedes independence. The distance across which a child can perform beyond their current level is known as the zone of proximal development. The distance between the actual development to date and the level of potential development as ascertained through guidance. So can we teach algebra to a third grader? Maybe, perhaps. It depends on if they possess the skills necessary to get to algebra. Can we teach algebra to an 8th grader? If they've been taught the skills beforehand, but ultimately, arguably, yes, you could teach algebra to an 8th grader. They've entered that zone based off of, it's like, for example, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's the story of the Headless Horseman by Washington Irving. Technically speaking, it's a 6th grade reading level. I have found difficulty teaching it over the years to even students who are in 12th grade. But it's technically a 6th grade reading level. So the point is this: according to Lexile level, I should arguably be able to teach 6th graders The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I should be able to do it because it's within their zone of proximal development. But that depends upon whether or not they are at a 6th grade reading level, or by the very least, what was considered a 6th grade reading level 150 years ago, if that makes sense. When you get a chance, check out this video on Vygotsky. It's a little bio video. So 3 major contributions to psychology that Vygotsky has made. Genetic development, I'm going to go more on the next slide. Social interaction is absolutely critical. Contrast this with Rousseau, the Noble Savage, which is all, if a child is raised by wolves, he will essentially become a child. Yeah, however, if a child was raised by wolves, most likely he's going to bark and communicate like the wolves do. Most likely. So the social environment is very important in which a child is learning in. Semiotic mediation, also known as signs and sign systems. Language is important here. So think of language not only as verbal language, but there are also different types of languages. So music is a language, math is a language, traffic signs is a language. If you're in the military, sometimes it's flag systems that are used to communicate ideas. In baseball, there's the hand symbols. Sign language is the hand signals and sign language as well. But how, as I said before, how do I know a tree is a tree? I know a tree is a tree because a more knowledgeable other at one point showed me the word tree. They showed me a picture of a tree, And then I was able to connect and make an abstract idea of, oh, this is what a tree is. So that's what we're talking about there. So this is about genetic development. Genetic development starts in the middle with microgenesis. This is when you're born. Everything that you're born with is microgenesis. And then ontogenesis. I'm going to be messing up these words again. Ontogenesis is the individual. So microgenesis is like you're born just like everybody else. You're born with what most people are born with. Then there's the individual of what makes you unique as an individual. I'm going to skip this ring for a second and go to the phylogenetic, which is the entire species. So the individual will then influence the entire species over time because genetically, as we learned from Darwin, things will stay, things will remain, but things will be removed based off of adaptability for survival. With that said, what Vygotsky adds to this is this third ring of social, cultural, historic. The social, historical, cultural moment is going to have an effect on the individual relating to the greater species. We can think of this in terms of race and ethnicity in a geographic area, because quite frankly, your racial culture is definitely affected by the time and place in which you live in. Even though ultimately everyone's a human being, there is a social, cultural, historical influence on their development. Think of this also in terms of the fact that there may be certain skills that may die away because of the social, historical moment. I'll give you an example. In ancient times, it was the poet that was seen as, they were called the warrior poet. The warrior poet they were both soldier and poet, and they were seen as the most important individual in that society because they carried the culture of the society. They carried the story of the people. That's why the warrior poet was most important. Fast forward to the 20th century, when you have the arms race and you have the Cold War, all of a sudden it's STEM, it's science and technology and mathematics, because and it's not so much about the arts. Yes, reading and writing is important, but reading and writing only in terms of the social, historical moment of the fact that we are in an arms race and we need to protect our people. It's not about celebrating our people, it's about protecting our people. So, and with that said, if you look at the 20th century, yes, you have still a lot of movements in the 20th century, but the movements, if you notice, are modern and postmodern, and they're not so much like they were in the past. If you look at the pre-20th century, when you look at like the Romantics and the people before the 20th century as I compared to the modernists. Now, I'm not saying that the realists and the modernists and the postmodernists aren't as skillful, or they're just very different. They're very different in the type of stories that they tell. And because the types of stories that they tell and the skills developed in their writing are solely dependent on the social, cultural, historical moment in which they're living in. That's why we have eras of writing. I hope that helps in trying to see how the social, cultural, historical moment, which Vygotsky emphasized, of how that affects the individual, and in affecting the individual, it affects the entire species. just coming back to this about the dialectical thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Reason why is that this is very much Karl Marx, which is very much uh, Vygotsky, who Vygotsky was influenced by. But again, you have an idea or a concept, let's say nature, the antithesis, which is nurture, and then the synthesis. So there's conflict between the thesis and the antithesis. This conflict is tries to be solved in the synthesis, say interactionism. And then we have a new standard, because now the synthesis becomes the new thesis and the process starts over again. Current perspectives related to Vygotsky. Elaboration of the idea that meaning is socially constructed. This is where we call mediated learning experiences. That's where mediation, his concept of mediation, comes in. Introduction of the concept of scaffolding. As I said before, all modern education, if you're going into teaching, everything is going to be about scaffolding. Everything is about scaffolding. Vygotsky has a very large influence on modern education. And think of scaffolding in a nutshell as support for challenging tasks. When the visual of the word scaffolding, think of when construction is being done, or when remodeling is being done on a current building. In order for it to be done, scaffolding has to be built in order to support the structure that's being built on. And only over time will that scaffolding be removed when the building can stand on its own without the scaffolding. Elaboration of ways in which children participate in adult activities, such as guided participation or cognitive apprenticeship. And then the recognition of how children teach other children, reciprocal teaching, how children can teach adults as well. Applying the ideas, help children acquire cognitive tools. Help children internalize cognitive strategies, use group activities like reciprocal teaching, provide reminders of what to do, present challenging tasks, and provide sufficient scaffolding. Help children develop strategies to scaffold themselves. Other way of looking at this is help children teach themselves. This is very big for me. I tell my students all the time, I'm teaching you how to teach yourselves because I'm not always going to be around to teach you. And because I'm not always going to be around to teach you, you need to develop the skills on your own. You need to develop the cognitive tools on your own. You need to develop the social and whatever other types of life skills on your own, because I'm not always going to be around to teach you. Help children develop strategies to scaffold themselves. That scaffolding is a skill unto itself. Assess children's abilities under a variety of work conditions, provide opportunities to engage in authentic activities, encourage and scaffold play. Look for examples of different types of play. Exploratory with objects, group play, imaginary play with symbolic objects, role taking. Here's what's important about this part. We can incorporate structured play into our instruction. Not only does it make it fun, but that structured play actually scaffolds certain skills. It's very Vygotskyan in nature. All right, so now let's compare Vygotsky to Piaget, because that's who he was criticizing. Piaget said that children are active, motivated learners who construct understanding based on their personal experiences. Piaget probably underestimated the capabilities of children and overestimated the capabilities of adolescents. Vygotsky said that humans differ from other species in their acquisition of complex mental processes, which are largely the legacy of cultural heritage. Where they're similar in their constructive processes, in their readiness for learning ideas, in the idea that it's important to challenge students and for social interaction. Where do they differ? They differ in their role of language. Piaget saw no purpose for what he called egocentric speech, which Vygotsky calls inner speech, inner talk. Um, so the role of language is different for them. The relative value of free exploration versus structured. Um, Vygotsky saw structured involvement as important. Piaget said, no, let the kids do what they need to do on their own. I'd probably say there should be a balance between the two. There should be a sense of structure for certain ideas, and there probably needs to be a sense of like let them go on their own, and if they fall, they fall. Like there's definitely room for both. Guided activities are different between the two. Relative importance of the interactions with peers versus adults, and the influence of culture. Vygotsky definitely saw cultural influence a lot stronger than Piaget did. Key takeaways, which could be test fodder in the future. Vygotsky's 3 contributions to general psychology, the genetic development, that's the circles that we looked at, social interaction, which was that third circle in the chart, semiotic mediation, which are the signs and sign systems such as language, the 4 concentric circles, which is the genetic development, as I said before, reciprocal teaching. The teacher does, the student watches, and that's the gradual. Oh, what did we call it? It was the gradual taking away. The what was that R? Forgetting what that R is. You'll be tested on all of these. Be sure to read chapter 10 if you haven't done so already. I feel like I flew through that today. I hope it was pretty short. I wanted to get this out to you today. I'm going to try to get to Bandora as soon as I can. I feel like I'm floating in space right now. All right. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to speak with you soon. I'll see you on GroupMe.